Can you tell me your name and what your connection is to the Katelyn Markham story?
My name is Tess Avelland, and I'm connected to the story ever since I heard John Carter interviewed live on WLW radio, I think about 3 days after Katelyn went missing. I just happened to flip on the radio and heard there's a missing girl in Fairfield, and here's her fiance. And I was like, oh, fascinating. And so I listened, and as I listened, I was like, okay, he just spoke of her in the past tense. That's not good. He didn't really answer that question. That's not good. But then other things he seemed very calm on, so I kind of came away from that with a very equivocal notion of John Carter, and I was like, well, I'm not going to be like, the boyfriend did it, because it's not always true, of course, and there were a few things that he seemed, reasonable on, but it certainly made me lift an eyebrow, and so I started following it, and then I found the Facebook page where people were discussing it, and I was like, oh, I'm definitely interested in this, and then I began participating in that, and then eventually I created a page where, sort of to collect the information that we were gleaning from the discussions on that page, and that scope broadened quite a lot. I would have probably begun it differently had I known, that it was going to be quite so instrumental in recording the info. But yeah, it was just sort of a way to give people a quick overview of the case and, get them up to speed if they were interested. So.
Yeah. And for somebody who's never heard about Katelyn Markham or her story or her case, in a nutshell, what do you tell them whenever somebody asks you about that?
Well, I give them the basics, which is, obviously this young woman, responsible, 21 years old, student, 2 jobs, went missing apparently from her home, in the middle of the night. Seemed like a relatively safe neighborhood. Last person to see her fiance, of course. That may or may not be significant. But then I usually go on to describe the fact that his alibi for the night was that he was at a friend's house burning her papers. And so that usually captures people's interest. They're like, oh, interesting, so do you think he did it? And I say, well, obviously he should be looked at, but you can't assume just from that he did do it. But it certainly looks suspicious. So.
Okay. And you, of course, got to hear the radio interview and found it a little bit troubling. What were your first impressions when you got to listen and analyze the 911 call?
Oh, yeah, the 911 call, actually, yes, I heard that after the live interview on the radio, in which he sounded very sincere. The 911 call tilted me in one direction, which is, I don't know about this. I felt that he was, well, my instinctual feeling, without sort of being educated on the points, was that he was not being forthcoming. And then as I read about deceptive markers in 911 calls, he hit several of them. I mean, the characteristic, deceptive markers, many were there, and that was disturbing.
What are 1 or 2 examples of deceptive markers that he used in there?
A polite greeting, a lack of urgency in the voice, not asking for help so much as explaining what was going on. It took him, I think, a minute and something to even mention her name in the 911 call, and he only mentioned her name after the dispatcher prompted him, so what's her name? Before then he hadn't mentioned her name at all. And he was very quick to say, I can't find her anywhere, and at the time she had been missing a very short time, technically, like 45 minutes, an hour, something like that she wasn't where she should have been. So it seemed odd to make an emergency call about that in such a short time. It wasn't even 4 or 5 hours. It was less than an hour, pretty much, or something like that. They asked, have you called the jails and the hospitals? He just said, and didn't answer the question. But he was quick to say, I was this, I was that, he seemed to be covering for himself. And then he put in the whole, we went to the Sacred Heart Festival this weekend, and there's some very sketchy people at this festival, is how he put it. And it seemed completely irrelevant to the fact that she was missing, because they hadn't even gone to the festival on the night she vanished. It was the night before. But he was real quick to sort of point the finger at, I don't know, carnies or something like that. So that seemed not useful as a thing to focus on if you were sincerely looking for your fiancé. It seemed like a red herring kind of a thing to focus on.
The crime scene, when police finally started to get there, can you describe it, or the lack thereof, of the things that they were looking for and what was missing?
Well, I only saw news footage of it. It didn't seem that they roped off the area or taped it off quickly enough. I think she was called in missing on a Sunday night. I think Wednesday they finally taped off the area. That seems, unusually late, considering that, the totality of circumstances of her disappearance and how it was uncharacteristic for her. She wasn't sort of a runaway type or a stay out and party for 3 days type, it seemed. And I felt like that was a little slow. I don't know how quickly they took away the keys of anybody who had keys to the place. Not being on the inside and being able to tell what they did, I can't really comment on how good or poor the police work was, but strictly on the outside, it looked a little inept to me.
Let's see. A few days go by, the investigation begins, she's officially missing. Searches begin for her. Were you able to participate in any of those?
No, actually, I had some health issues that kind of prevented me from, at the time, from being out for very long, sort of marching through the woods type thing, but I was acutely aware of it and watching and learning everything I could about it. So, yeah.
And at this time, you're starting to build transcripts and a few other things, and you're putting information together. At that point, what about this case just really spoke to you and made you want to be so passionate about it?
Well, I'd always been interested in missing person cases, from 100 years old ones, whatever, historical missing person cases. So it was intriguing just from that standpoint, but the fact that it was local caught my attention, of course. And just the circumstances of the whole thing, I guess, caught my attention because it seemed that there were peculiarities in some of the fiancé, the last person to see her, in some of his comments. And the reason I typed up the transcripts was because we'd all sort of listened to the audio or watched the video and came away with one impression or, various impressions. But then when you actually typed it out, what he said, as opposed to how he said it, the words were kind of alarming. Like he would say something in a very sincere sounding voice, but when you looked at the factual information that he provided in his speech, it was quite different from that. And I was kind of intrigued by that. And so I thought, well, I'm going to transcribe everything, so we have a sort of a verbal record. We could do a search. What exactly did he say about the door? Was it locked, not locked, etc.? Little details like that. We could refer directly to what he said as opposed to our impressions of what he'd said. And so that's why I created the transcripts. And as I did, I got more and more intrigued. And that's when I did the research and found out the deceptive markers and the 911 calls and so forth.
Did John appear on Nancy Grace?
Yes, twice.
Okay. What were your impressions of his appearances? I guess they were phone-in interference.
Yes.
Okay. What were your impressions of those?
Well, that's a difficult question. Not good. I will say that. He got the simplest things wrong, including Nancy Grace said something like, "Yeah, you're going someplace at midnight," and he said, "Oh, I'm 22." He was 23. So, just from that basis, I don't know, many things he said were factually inaccurate, simple things, including his own age. There was a point, I think, in the first Nancy Grace interview, although it may have been the second, but it was actually removed from the audio that they put on the website for the Nancy Grace transcripts, and I ended up being able to transcribe it only because somebody had recorded it directly from the TV. And that was where they, in other words, somebody had cut that part out of the sort of subsequent, recordings. But they asked him a question, and he laughed. He did this very strange sort of peal of laughter and sort of gasping noises, and I thought that was completely bizarre, and I saw it live. And then, and when I went to look for that part, when I was transcribing the Nancy Grace interview, I couldn't find that part. It had been cut out. I thought that was very, very strange. He said he'd taken a lie detector test. He had not. Things like that. Nancy Grace said, he claimed to her, I went to my friend's house and we all sat around watching some TV. And she said, "What did you watch?" And he said, "Huh?" Which is called the "huh" moment of deceptive responses to things. And, just random background noise things. I thought that was fishy. He couldn't remember what he was watching. So, and also we knew, I think, before, it might have been after the Nancy Grace interviews aired, his friends came on to the Facebook discussion page, and 3 of them spoke about his presence that night, but they all gave different times of when he departed. He said he left about 2. One friend said he left at 3, and another friend said he left at 4. So this is obviously very eye-catching and interesting.
Were you wondering, honestly, what were you wondering about what the end result would it be? Did you think at the point that she might be found alive?
No. I thought within probably within 2 or 3 days of the interview that I heard live on the radio, I thought she's dead. And when I heard the radio interview, I thought it as well, but I, again, tried to keep an open mind. You can't always suspect the boyfriend. Things look bad. Maybe they're not bad. But no, I pretty much knew she was dead. I thought she had to be dead. But where was she? It was the question. And, I used to think, before going to sleep at night, I would say, "Katelyn, where are you? Where are you? Is there any way you can tell me?" And to dream anything, I really sort of, and I'm usually skeptical about those types of things, but I basically thought, anything, I'll do anything to find this poor girl. Yeah.
When she was eventually found, do you remember that day, what you were doing, how it affected you?
Yes, that wasn't good. Well, there was a statement, I guess, in the news about a body found in Indiana. And of course, I'm an East Sider of Cincinnati, so I hadn't really thought about how close, of course, Indiana is to Fairfield. And I was like, oh, that may not be related. But then, as time went by, it seemed more and more likely, hours, that it might be her. And I think it took about 2 or 3 days until they did the dental records and found out it was her. And when that was confirmed, I was actually discussing it online with a couple of friends that I'd met through the Katelyn discussion page. And all of us just said, they confirmed it's her. It is her. I have to go. Yeah, I'm going to go too. Okay, I'll talk to you later. We all just signed off. We couldn't talk anymore about it. And I got very upset, and I cried and so forth. I obviously I'd never met this girl, but she's sort of symbolic of all kinds of lost girls everywhere, victimized girls, and I got quite upset and said she was thrown away like a piece of trash, you know, and got very, very, very angry and upset about that.
The place she was found, you did a little bit of limited research, but you also discussed it with the discussion groups. Was there any special reason, you think, to why she was found on this old country road in Indiana?
Well, I had not done the sort of the internet research that some other people had done into John Carter's family and family connections and their properties and so forth. Quite a few people have done a very good job of that. I wasn't one of them. I just sort of was examining other aspects of the case. And when I realized that where she was found was literally, well, it was like 30 miles from her home, I think, but literally en route to John Carter's parents' property in Indiana, I was like, oh, I mean, yeah. Obviously that was circumstantially significant.
Do you think this case will ever be solved?
I hope so. I think that depends on what kind of police work was probably done at the beginning, which, again, I don't know. I would like to think it was competent police work. I have no idea. It may not have been. And if it wasn't, if they didn't take this seriously enough, fast enough, then I'm worried that they lost out on crucial information that could have solved it. Obviously, they need enough evidence to make an arrest of any kind. Whether they have that evidence, I don't know. I assume not, since it's not been, there's been no arrest, obviously no prosecution so far. I think the case probably hinges upon people coming forward that know something, if there are people that know something, which I'm really worried that there aren't. I'm worried that this was entirely conducted by one person who really did not need accomplices to achieve what he achieved. And if that's the case, then I hold out very little hope. Hopefully, however, there was more to it than that. Or hopefully the police have been more close-mouthed about evidence that they have, which could aid in eventual prosecution.
During the entire process, have you had a chance to meet David Markham or his any other family members?
Yeah, I met Dave and Allie, Katelyn's sister, a couple times at different events. There was an event held almost exactly 1 year before she was found in April, and I was one of the co-coordinators of that event, and brought, flowers and ribbons and things like that to it, and talked a little bit to Allie Markham and to Dave, just sort of introduced myself, and shook his hand. And I didn't want to, I'm sure they had plenty of emotions and a lot of people wanting their attention, so I didn't want to put myself forward and be in their way in any way, but it was good to see them and meet them.
What type of strength must they have to be able to endure what they've endured?
I can't even imagine being in their position. I don't know how they've had the patience and forbearance to deal with this when there's, it's not, I guess I could say such a likely culprit. It's not a strict mystery as in we have no idea what's happened here. I think there's some idea of what's happened there, and given that, I think they have phenomenal amounts of fortitude, and well, I have great admiration for them.